Of the morning from the East Coast, and welcome to this session 3.1 on empowering consumers. And as you've seen from the outline, this session will explore the effects of new technology on consumers, their decision-making, their choice, and also consent, and how we can build capacity and empower consumers to achieve greater benefits, particularly through the access and use of digital technologies. My name's Andrew Stevens. I'm the chair of this session. And there's a couple of roles that are, I think, important background for this role. One, I chair the data standards body for the consumer data right in Australia. And secondly, I chair also the Innovation and Science Australia Board, which is a board advising the federal government on innovation. And you couldn't get two more relevant topics and points of context for this discussion. Can I introduce our panel also? Professor Jeannie Paterson, Centre for AI and Digital Ethics at Melbourne Uni. Jeannie's research covers three interrelated themes that will see us right around the bullseye of this particular session: the effect of new technologies on consumer decision-making, choice and consent, protection for consumers experiencing vulnerability, and thirdly, regulatory design for AI that is safe, fair and fit for consumer purposes. Secondly, we have Ellen Broad with us from the 3A Institute at ANU. Prior to joining 3AI, I worked closely with Ellen when she was the technical lead for the Consumer Data Right Data Standards body, and when she was involved in that with us over a year ago now. So Ellen knows exactly. Ellen is, well, I don't know if we could quite call it bestseller, Ellen, but is the author of a book called Made by Humans, The AI Condition. And again, I could commend that book to you if you want to really understand the human aspect and the realities of AI in today's context. And thirdly, our third panellist is Scott Farrell. And anyone who's focused any attention at all on the consumer data right would know of the name Scott Farrell. Scott led the open banking review that recommended not open banking, but in fact a consumer data right, cross-sector, cross-industry, a whole of economy that enabled consumers to direct that data held about them would be made available to trusted third parties. He's just submitted to the government his second report on future directions for that whole initiative, and as well as advising many jurisdictions around the world and his ongoing advice in Australia on that topic. He's also about to kick off a payments review for the federal government as well. And again, I think you'd say that we have yet another panellist who's exactly on the target here for this topic. So we're going to have a question and answer based panel today. Also, there's an opportunity using Pigeonhole for you to submit questions as well. We've only got 35 minutes, and there is also a poll with two particular questions that you'll see on the Pigeonhole app. But firstly, Jeannie, if I might go to you, and that really, it seems that in thinking about this, that can consumers really be empowered without technology? And the other side is, have we got the arrangements right for empowerment of consumers, given the technology and the arrangements and schema that we have? So why don't you lead us off, please?
Thanks, Andrew. Those are pretty big questions, but they summarise, I think, the theme of today. So, yes, consumers need technology to be empowered, and I think technology offers lots of potential for consumers to participate with more confidence in the economy, and in particular the group of consumers that I'm interested in, consumers with disabilities or consumers who are in some way disadvantaged by living in rural areas, consumers without English as their first language, and so on. Technology offers tremendous potential to bring people into civic space and into the marketplace, and to have greater opportunities for choice and participation. So there's lots of potential, but it's really important, the design of the regulatory scheme that we put around that. So you're spot on the money there. In this space, we hear a lot of discussion about privacy and data rights, and that's really important because, of course, consumers need to be able to make choices about where their data goes, how it's used, the profiles that are created about them. But it's also important that we focus on the technology itself. When we're dealing with ordinary products, we expect them to reach certain standards. We expect them to be fit for purpose. We expect them to be safe. We expect them to do what it said they're going to do. And those sorts of standards also have a role when we're talking about digital technologies and digital products. We need to think about how we move those standards into the digital space and how we think about what it means for, say, an AI-enabled tool to be fit for purpose, safe and helpful.
Excellent, Jeannie. Just a quick follow-up then. So how is the issue that the arrangements, regulations, and let's call it the schema, doesn't exist, or it does exist, but we haven't quite learned how to use it properly as consumers, in your view?
I think it does exist, but I think it could be made to work better, and I think we need to get better at joining up the various bits of the regime. So we have the consumer data right, for example, which I know that Ellen and Scott will speak about, but one of the aims of that is to give consumers more choice, and it has an elegant structure for doing that. It uses technology to allow consumers to manage and control their own data. But if we move to the Privacy Act mechanisms for control and consent are different from the consumer data right. And if we move back to the Australian consumer law, the schema is different again. So what I'd like to see is not more law, but greater coherence between the law that we have.
Interesting point. And Scott, just to talk, if you can please, about some of the thinking behind your recommendations in the consumer data right, in this thing about, is it mandatory, is it optional, and where does the consumer work? Because it seems to me, from my experience and seeing that the way in which you've got the balance there is an important part of this, basically protect the consumer versus empower consumer. And there's a plane here and a balance. Can you just give us some thoughts on that, Scott?
Yes, so, thanks, Andrew. And the key to that is on the front cover of my original open banking report. There's 4 words. And indeed, all the subsequent work I've done in this area for the Australian and other governments have always come back to those 4 words. And the first word is a word that Professor Paterson used, which is it's about the customer or the consumer. Everything is much easier if you have a little bit of empathy and try and stand in that consumer's shoes rather than standing from outside. Then you can see the balance. And the next words give you that balance in the sense of, I need to give this person a choice. I need to make it easy for them to make this choice. I need to give them convenience. And also, I need to make them confident to share their information for their own benefit, by not making them scared, not making them fearful, not making them lock up something that could benefit them hugely, but giving them a framework that allows them. It's like driving a car. Like in the sense of, we need to have safe vehicles, we need to have driving licenses, but goodness, how were you going to get to the beach yesterday when it was so terribly hot unless you actually had a car to get there? And so this sense of the balance between protecting everyone from themselves and as a result, not allowing anyone to use this, which of course doesn't happen because they go and share their information anyway in an unsafe way, which seems to me to be a suboptimal outcome, because our role is to allow people to be protected, not to protect ourselves, is to allow everyone to be protected. To use that analogy, once they get to the beach, we should have some red and yellow flags showing where it's safer to swim, but they're going to swim because it is so incredibly hot. They're going to go in swimming. The idea, for example, of either closing the beach, which yesterday would have been, for those of you who are not in Sydney, yesterday was fearsomely hot. The idea of closing the beach, they would just wander into the water anyway. And so I think this balance is important, and you would see that as soon as you put yourself into the shoes of a wide variety of consumers to work out, well, what will allow them to make a choice to suit them safely. I'm not going to make the choice because I'm not them, but I need to have some empathy to give them the range of choices that they need.
Thanks, Scott. And Ellen, just to follow that theme a little bit more on the consumer then, so that the consumer decides, what are some of the use cases and possibilities that you've seen already from your knowledge of the CDR, but also, more importantly, how do we actually educate, develop, build the capability at the consumer level so that the consumers understand the decision-making and the optionality that they have? You got some examples?
Yeah, so I do have some examples. And just before I get to the examples, I wanted to touch on the word empowerment that we use because one of the first kind of key principles or recognition that we have when we talk about empowerment is it means recognizing people where they are and that they have different skills and capabilities and they may require different kinds of intermediaries, different kinds of support. 10 years before we started talking about open banking and then the consumer data right, we were talking about my data, where one of the ideas was we'll just give people bulk copies of their information and they'll just figure out how to use it. And that's empowering them, is we'll just give them these enormous raw data sets of everything that they're doing. And then the recognition came that empowerment means providing people with infrastructure, with intermediaries, with different levels of support, meeting them where their needs are. And to Scott's kind of flags analogy, that's what really excited me about something like the consumer data right, is it's an attempt to create an infrastructure that is flexible enough to account for different needs and capabilities among consumers. So to your examples, Andrew, it can be anything from, for your already relatively budget-savvy consumers, an example that I'm still wildly frustrated by in Australia is the complete lack of personal budgeting apps that don't require you to hand over your bank login details. Actually, before joining the Consumer Data Right program, we used one of these to try and manage our household expenditure, where the only way that you can really provide a micro-level, detailed account of your financial transactions across banks. I'm a household. We have multiple bank accounts with multiple banking institutions, each with, at that point in time, their own infrastructure. The only way that we could actually get an aggregated what is groceries, what is travel, was to give over our bank login details and trust that app provider that they would just store those bank login details appropriately. And even though we knew that we were in breach of our bank accounts, even using an app like that, because you're not supposed to give over your bank login details. So like it's simple things like that that we don't quite realize, even to access some of the infrastructure that, what's that book everyone was reading? Barefoot Investor. Even to access some of the services that hugely popular personal budgeting gurus like the Barefoot Investor advertise, actually rely in some instances on, until something like the CDR is in place, relatively unsafe infrastructure. It can also be providing people with support when they're in financial difficulty. So providing services for people who are managing financial distress through third-party trusted intermediaries that are not your bank, where your bank's interests may be different from yours as someone that's in financial distress. I've seen some really quirky ideas like, can I top up the cents to the dollar for every purchase that I make and put it into a charitable donations account? That's another service provider idea that's underway in the UK, where you can essentially set up an intermediary that provides right transactions on your account so that you are always either topping up an account for saving or topping up an account for donations. So there's a variety of ways in which it can be used. I think the point that I'd make to Scott's is that some of this is already technically possible. It is just perhaps not in a safe, visible infrastructure. And it's how do we create something like the CDR around it? Like, as I said, I could keep using that budgeting app that would require me to hand over my bank login details.
So, Jeannie, let's head down that path about control, and we're going to hit consent before long. So let's go right now. Talk to us about, because it seems to me between those two vectors of privacy and protection and empowerment, right down the middle is this thing called consent. And we've had some experience from our consumer experience research, but just interested in the results of your research, your thinking on this point on consent. It's a big concept. Where are consumers today? I know it's dangerous to generalise, but where are we generally? What are the issues involved, and how do we make the most of this opportunity?
Well, that's again a great question, Andrew. I guess from my perspective, I don't see protection and empowerment as being alternatives. They're not sitting at different sides of the table. You don't have to trade off one for the other. What we know about people is that they're limited in time, and they're limited in experience, and they're actually limited in cognitive space. So we need to protect consumers in order to give them the opportunity to make the choices that are important to them. None of us want to make a decision about every single interaction we have with technology. And equally, none of us are able to do the due diligence that's necessary to know that all of the apps that Ellen's talking about are actually reputable, safe, actually provide the service that's promised. So what I see consumer protection law writ large is doing is providing that safety net within which consumers can manage their day-to-day affairs. So in Australia, we're really lucky. We know we have a set of rules that say, if people say to you, we're going to give you budgeting advice, they actually have to give you budgeting advice as opposed to stealing Ellen's household data and going and doing something untoward with it. So truly, safety, that sort of baseline of safety consumer protection is really important to allow consumers to exercise choice. And then we're thinking about choice. There's some things that we can do to make it easier for consumers to make the big decisions that are important to them. One of the suggestions that I've seen floating around in relation to, for example, the consumer data right and privacy is that when we're asked to consent about data sharing, it'd be really useful to consumers if the request and the information that we're asked to read before consenting was always the same. If consumers suffer from information overload, so the more we can do to make it easier for them, standard consents, standard notice provisions, and make use of technology. I love in the discussion paper that Scott's been working on, we have an idea of consent dashboards. So we don't make consumers read more words, they're able to look at something that helps them manage the type of interactions they're having with data and with technology.
And Scott, on this consent point, because the experience from the consumer experience research that we've done in the data standards body is, and these are multi-location, multi-demographic, racial, income, socioeconomic, the works. Basically, the thing that's universal is when you raise the concept of consent, the consumer at the starting point is almost like, I don't understand what it is, I'm resigned to not having it, and therefore why is this relevant? And once we then explain that to them, their views on consent there. How deep and how specific does consent get, Scott, in your view? How important is it? And how much is that a saviour in this environment here of empowerment?
Well, this is a balance too, and Professor Paterson did actually touch on this perfectly in the sense of we all share information all of the time. The last time you went to the shops, you probably would get fairly annoyed is if every time you shared information, you were asked to provide a consent. Indeed, you don't do that with money, and money is kind of valuable too. So I like looking back at what controls do we have in relation to people's agreement for their money to be used, because they are comfortable with that, and that is very valuable to them. So for some things, it's absolutely critical. Now, I think, Andrew, you touched on something quite important there in relation to how specific it needs to be and how much protection comes from it, and also a starting point that people are beginning to have, which is, oh, well, it's already out there. And I think philosophically, that's the biggest issue, in the sense that a lot of, I'll say, lawyers and laws in the past have been driven around enabling people to use your information if something has happened, as opposed to sharing the use of it with you for a particular purpose. And that latter part is where we really need a change in thinking, saying, no, you can share in this benefit too. And it's not a question that you just give it away forever and you get $10 or whatever it is. That's not what I think is fair at all. I think it's more about, well, this can be used for this particular purpose. This is a big purpose. So we're going to ask you about it, and we're going to try and use words that real people use and not legal words. And again, I agree with, I'll use your first name now, Jeannie. Agree entirely with what Jeannie said there. But then the other side is, let's not be too get overboard here, it's not all the time, right? You must be able to agree in advance that this sort of thing is okay. And the reason I say that you must be able to is you do it now with your money. And when I come back to working out what are real people's expectations, real people's expectations include a balance or a judgment around when you are using something valuable, which I share, then here is where I expect to be involved in that decision. And here is when I expect to be told that something's gone wrong. The interesting thing for where we are now is this journey is only beginning. So we're trying to work out where is the point that we want to bother people and we don't want to bother people. And in my view, the best way of working that out is involving them, involving real people in this process so we can learn. And the second point, I certainly think we should be using real people language, not legal language, because a lot of the risks don't come around the nuances of words that lawyers like me would write. They come from things like point blank, I had no idea you were doing that with my information.
Yeah, exactly. And so just to then set the scene a bit, because we've talked a lot about CDR and we've assumed that everybody knows about it, but basically Scott's design that the government have adopted, and it is quite well known how world leading this is that there are three parties involved. There's a data holder who holds information about me, like my banking transactions or my energy transactions, my usage, my payments, whatever. There's a consumer, obviously very important, and there's potentially a recipient. And the consumer data right enables the consumer to direct that the data holder provides the data to the data recipient so that the data recipient can use that data and make offers to the consumer that will be in competition with the data holder. And this is not just in banking or not just in energy, but across economy-wide. And if we think about how consumers are largely dealt with and marketed to by companies today, we've moved on from observing a subset of consumers behind one-way glass and somehow grouping consumers into two or three segments into use of all of this data, de-identified apparently, and then creation of personas. So in the retail context, it could be the hesitant essentials buyer, which would be probably largely male. I don't really like shopping, and I go there when I absolutely have to and buy the bare minimum. So all of these personas are there, and basically then companies are working as to which persona that you seem to fit in, and we will market our services and our products to you, recognising or on the expectation that you're in that persona. But the reality is that, a bit like studying primates, why do you study primates in the wild? Because they don't live in controlled laboratories, is none of us actually live in personas. And this is, again, in quoting it back to Ellen's book on Made by Humans, is the reality that we might think that people fit into a certain thing, but the reality is they don't. So the question is, how can I leverage the personalisation power that's inherent in the data that's held about me? And how do I control it? So if you think about consent, then you've got to consent that the data holder discloses it to somebody. You've got to consent that the data recipient that you've nominated is going to collect that data, and separate to collecting, you might also consent to them using it in a certain way based on your use case. So if you think of a responsible lending type construct, then it's not that dissimilar in some principles to it. But the reality is you're not obliged to do it. You're not obliged to make any decision to move away from the existing supplier. The existing supplier and the data holder isn't obliged to make a counter offer. It's basically entirely optional. And again, Scott's analogy of I've headed to the beach and I've got to make a decision. Do I swim over there near the rocks, or do I swim where the yellow and red flags are, where I'm supervised and there's been an assessment made that I'm safer? But that's the nature of the consumer data right. And that consent element, that central element, is quite an important element, I think, in swinging the balance towards empowerment. But it's a big, big thing. And so those of you who've used QR codes when you go to venue X, in the COVID environment. And then you get down below the thing which says, can we market to you and send you offers relating to this? I never met anybody who's actually ticked that. And I must say, I've never had a situation where someone's marketed to me where I haven't ticked it. So the compliance level is good. But this whole area of accessing the value and the predictive power of my own transactions rather than the averaging that I'm getting using in persona-based marketing, which is sort of like the leading edge that we've had up to now, is
Andrew, can I make a comment in that?
Please.
It's just that I think what you're saying is really important, but I think it goes further. So if we're talking about financial services, most consumers don't get financial advice about investment, and consumers who are thinking about borrowing money to, say, buy a house, a really important purchase, often use mortgage brokers, and ASIC's recent report said mortgage brokers add minimal value, in fact, to the decision-making processes of those consumers. So in Australia anyway, we've got consumers who are woefully lacking in financial advice that they need to make the most of the most important investment, their house, and saving for their retirement. That's really important. And part of the potential of something like the consumer data right, to go to Ellen's point, is to have intermediaries that are actually using consumers' own data and are able to provide low cost and value-adding services to people in this sphere. How do we get people to use those services? Yes, it's a matter of consent, but it's also a matter of earned trust. Ellen just spoke about the fact she had to hand over her password to her account in order to get help with budgeting. That sort of behaviour doesn't build trust, where open, transparent and lawful use of data does. So if I think we ask how we're going to get consumers to consent, it's about proving the value of the service to them and about building trust in the service, something that's been woefully lacking in financial services in recent times. Love to hear Scott's view, and indeed Ellen's on that.
Yeah, please. Ellen.
So I was thinking about this relationship between consent and empowerment, and I do not think the act of consent is the mechanism by which empowerment occurs. Because if you accept as a starting level that no matter how well we script the act of consent or how standardized our consents, that each person comes to the process of consent with their own, are they actually even able to give free and voluntary consent in this context where they only have one choice in a practical sense? So to Jeannie's example of, say, getting financial advice on the purchase of a mortgage, and there's only mortgage brokers that you can choose from because these low-cost trusted providers don't yet exist. I basically think it is not the way that consent is drafted or the idea that we can get to a standard of consent where people are completely able to make free, informed, voluntary decisions that is the standard that we aspire to. Because if you look in any other industry, that is not the standard we aspire to, because that still puts the responsibility ultimately on the individual to consent in some way. I quite often think about what are the behaviours in the organisations forced to provide consent in these formats? What behaviours and expectations does it set for them? So is the purpose of consent to give the consumer this free, voluntary, informed choice, which I just frankly, maybe that's controversial, but I don't think it is? Or is perhaps at least a purpose that it commits organisations in the act of being forced to ask for consent to a set of behaviours and expectations and practices that will perhaps restrict more untrustworthy, unsafe behaviour? Because I think it's more interesting to look at the expectations it sets around the organisations forced to ask for consent and in those formats than necessarily like, are consumers empowered by seeking consent? I think there's lots of instances in which we're not, no matter our best intentions.
Yeah, sure. Scott, have you got a view?
Well, I agree with Ellen there. It's I see it as raising a set of promises from the data recipient, and that set of promises will start to engender expectations. Most of law is not about the law, it's about the behaviours which contravening the law will prohibit. And so people People don't speed all the time just waiting to get booked. They say, well, I'm going to get booked, so how about I don't speed? And so I think I really do agree with Ellen in the sense of having consent as a promise as to how I will use something of value to both of us, and I will only use it in this way, does change the way you think about it. Is to, hey, you've given me access to your valuable thing and I'm enjoying it, and I'm giving you some stuff and I'm doing some other stuff, and changes that to, actually, I've promised I'm going to do this. Actually, I better have some structures around making sure that I fulfill my promises as well, Jeannie, and something you came back to earlier on. There should be a sanction that I have as a customer if you breach my promise. Not dissimilar to, you told me you were going to do this with my money and you did that with my money. Seriously, not on. You've got to actually do what you said. So I think, and that trust element, I believe, comes from having confidence that the expected conduct is going to be fulfilled. But at the moment, we don't really have a firm basis for that resonates in real people's minds. And I think the idea of a consent as a promise, it can mean something to real people. I gave it to you for this purpose. That's all you're supposed to do with it. That's an easy thing to communicate, although the consent itself is hard to communicate. But I think technology can really help actually make it easier for it to just happen. And to one of the points that's really important is no one knows really how complex our world is to actually make our money get to where it has to go. And that is fantastic because it just does it. And I don't think we need to bring real people into a whole lot of the complexity. We need the complexity to fulfill real people's expectations as to what should be happening with something which they value.
We've got 4 minutes to go, and at this point, there's no questions from the audience, but I do have the emerging poll results. So just the flip side of the promise and the person who basically acts and under that is the other side of that, which is the enterprise, which then actually makes the commitment and provides the environment and the services and the products. So you could be excused sitting in the audience here thinking this is about, well, there's rules and regulations and I've just got to comply with this. But aren't we really talking about the way that the ultimate sunlight, I guess, which is the competitive dynamic, that in the end, we're going to end up with this is the way in which this trustworthy way, this data-rich way in which businesses will operate and service and make offers to us. And then we will have to make assessments on trust, on value, and on, basically degree of fit. So is this about really comply or is this about compete, if you look at the enterprise aspect, Scott?
So one thing that I find with most businesses, large and small, I deal with, is they really like a clear regulatory environment so that the customer and everyone knows where the rules are. Otherwise, you have to spend so much time managing a risk that you don't understand. So the idea of effectively lifting up the playing field that they're competing on, so they're no longer competing on being able to create a mechanism for their customers to provide them information. They're competing on what they can provide their customers with information, knowing we've got a safe field for doing so. That confidence improves business as well. It's very important to customers or consumers, but it's very important to business, because if there is a framework that says, well, here's where the rules are, businesses could choose to invest in that. And businesses like investing in customers. And if they don't stay in business for very long. And I think the most important part about that is it allows all sorts of businesses to use information that their customers choose to provide, and not just businesses that traditionally have been data focused. Because as an Australian, I don't have banking data, I don't have energy data, I don't have telco data, I just have information about me. And quite frankly, I just want to use it so my life is easier when I go to the shops, or that my life is easier when I get a home loan. I just want my life to be easier. And I think that competition point is a real opportunity.
Yeah, I think so.
If I could just jump in, I agree with Scott says, but not entirely, because all of the industries that we're speaking about here are essentially essential services. Nobody can participate in society without access to banking, telecommunications or electricity. So competition's fine, but the problem with competition is it doesn't tend to serve all members of the community. That's why we have rules about access to service. So I'd like to see more than competition, and I know Scott's not saying competition at all, Scott's all costs, but it's really important in relation to these kinds of services that I'll come back to the point that we keep making, which is that we need rules in place that say that those services are provided in a way that's fair, safe and inclusive. And competition doesn't necessarily promote inclusive services. And they're essential. We need to make sure that there's rules that everybody gets them.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes that the discriminatory impacts of that information aren't used against in some cases, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Ellen, one final point? You've got a minute.
Oh gosh, to have the final minute. No, I just think I agree with particularly Jeannie's points just then, that particularly these sectors in Australia are sectors within which your options as consumers are often limited. What potentially excites me, though, about something like the Consumer Data Right is, to Scott's point, the way that facilitating greater visibility for consumers about, for example, what their financial institution is really charging them for their own accounts and their own loans changes the kinds of services that another financial institution might offer them. Just even giving people some visibility of the activities undertaken allegedly on their behalf, how might that change behaviours overall across the sector? It's my hope.
Excellent. Well, that's all we've got time for. There are no questions from the audience, so I've got two things I need to do. Firstly, I would just encourage you all to attend the next session, which is the Scientists/Technologists Perspective, which commences at 12:40 Eastern Time. And just on the poll results, interesting. The first question, do you actively control online privacy settings and manage security of your data? Always 42.9%, sometimes 50%, rarely 7.1%, never 0%. Do you intend to make use of the Consumer Data Right? Yes, 15.4%. No responses. Don't know enough about it, 84.6%. So there we go. There's some feedback for a whole range of very interesting contexts. Let me just thank, on behalf of our audience, you, Ellen Broad, Jeannie Paterson, and also Scott Farrell, for your part in this process. It's been an interesting discussion. And again, I think we've explored this continuum between, and as Jeannie has said, it's not just or between protection and empowerment, it's and that's the process. So with that, I'll bid you all good day. Thank you.